So thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm Alexander Westphal. There's a group of us speaking today, and we're going to be speaking about the title here, Pathways to Problematic Sexual Behaviors in Autism. I will be speaking about risk factors and things which we think can create risky situations for people with autism. Laurie Sperry will be talking about the limited applicability of some models. Mr. Mahoney will be talking about communicating autism spectrum disorders and related impairments to the court system. And then finally, Rachel Loftin will be talking about implications for instruction and prevention. Yes. So sorry, was that a question or no? Okay, so as I imagine you know at this point, autism spectrum is a condition that undermines one's ability to relate socially. This can be manifest in many ways, including difficulty understanding social and romantic relationships and the rules governing social behavior. Given that the criminal justice system exists to govern social behaviors, it's not surprising that a disability in social cognition and judgment could result in legally problematic behavior, including sexual behaviors. In many cases, the social differences of people with autism become increasingly evident in the context of puberty and the onset of sexuality. During puberty, development accelerates rapidly, and social exchanges become more complex and nuanced. Thus, individuals with autism who are already struggling may find it even more difficult to develop friendships and to develop a romantic relationship. Although the development of relationships can be challenging, this does not mean that people with autism don't want intimacy. However, they may sometimes lack the social skills necessary to establish and maintain these relationships. I've always been struck by the accuracy of the categories Wing and Gould used in the late 70s to describe social behaviors in autism. They described three categories: aloof, those who didn't have an interest in relationship; passive, those who don't seek out relationships but are receptive to them; and finally, socially active but odd, those who seek relationships but often in a peculiar or inappropriate way. People in these latter two categories are clearly vulnerable to being taken advantage of, but it's really this last category, the socially active but odd, where problems most commonly arise in the arena we're talking about. I wanted to play a brief clip from a film, which I'll get to in a second, but thinking about this social disability in autism, this core feature of autism, the problem with understanding relationships, engaging the appropriateness of a behavior, this can result in anything from a clunky social style to behavior that is clearly illegal. Here's an example from Adam, and you can see how a clumsy romantic overture in this case went wrong. So.
Enough with the presents, okay?
Well, that was kind of awful, wasn't it? I mean, God, you just stop by to watch the kids. I do that for a living. Please freak me out, too,
Do you want to come in?
Okay.
So you live alone?
Yes.
I mean, it's big for one person. For the city.
Well, my father lived here too.
Oh, where is he now?
Queens.
Queens?
He died 6 weeks ago.
Oh, God, I'm so sorry.
My friend Harlan says Queens is where everybody goes to die because they can't tell the difference.
It's awful.
Harlan said it was a joke.
Oh, I meant about your father. What about your mother?
She died when I was 8.
I'm so sorry. I had a really nice time last night in the park.
Were you excited?
What?
sexually when we were in the park?
Uh, no, not exactly.
Well, I asked because I was, and I wondered if you were too.
Thank you so much for the glass of water.
So you can see Adam's contribution to this situation was a lack of insight into the way his behavior would come across to Beth. A breakdown in the theory of mind, if you will, something I'll discuss a little bit more about in a moment. But it's not just the social domain directly that can lead to problem behaviors. Another core characteristic of autism is restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Sometimes these interests have a sexual dimension, for example, an overwhelming interest in anime pornography. Other times, a special interest may not be sexual in nature, although it may appear so. For example, I worked with a young man with autism and an intellectual disability who showed a strong interest in odors, particularly perfumes. This interest was pervasive. He ordered items that smelled strongly, always requested perfumes as gifts, and attempted to smell everyone he met, except for men. The fact that he was disabled was evident, and thus those he approached considered his desire to smell them as humorous but benign, and generally did not mind. He was also taught to ask permission before he approached people. However, in one instance in a public shop, he approached a young woman and asked for permission to smell her. She was upset by his request, pushed him away, and screamed. He also began to scream. As a result, the store security officers intervened, the police were called, and the young man was arrested. Subsequently, it was established that the young woman felt she was about to be sexually assaulted. In this case, the behavior associated with his special interest was misinterpreted as sexual, leading to the involvement of law enforcement. Both the example from Adam and the case I just described represent breakdowns in theory of mind, a breakdown in someone's ability to understand the way in which their behavior may appear to others. I'm going to link this to an idea which will be referenced in all of our talks, the concept of counterfeit deviance. But before I get there, I want to give just a quick refresher on theory of mind. So this is the Sally Ann task. You see Sally and you see Ann. Sally puts her bowl in the basket while Ann's sitting there. Sally goes away. Ann moves the ball to her box. The question is, where will Sally look for her ball? And so someone with intact theory of mind would recognize that Sally was not present when the ball was moved, and so expect her to look for it in the basket. On the other hand, someone with some sort of impairment in theory of mind might think that that Sally would look for the ball in the box because the ball is in the box, so that would make perfect sense. So again, just to make this point, theory of mind leads to a breakdown in one's ability to understand how their behavior may appear, and in turn, possibly problematic behaviors that may be misinterpreted as deviant. So on to this topic of counterfeit deviance. Obviously, people with autism, like anyone else, are capable of committing criminal acts. For this discussion, I wanted to divide things into two categories: that kind of legitimate perpetration I just mentioned, and counterfeit perpetration. I want to use the perfume case I spoke about as an illustration for this topic. Although the guy did approach someone, his intentions were not scary, but she interpreted his behavior as indicating that he was about to do something violent. This is a key point. Behaviors which in a typical person might be indicators of something alarming might in someone with autism come from an entirely different source. And this is what, in a way, we're calling counterfeit deviance. I first encountered this term in the work of an attorney, Mark Mahoney, who's here today, who applied the concept to autism. But the term dates back to 1991 in Griffiths, Hingsberger, and Quincy, who used it to describe a scenario in which a person with intellectual disability behaved in a way which appeared to be paraphilic or sexually deviant, but in fact was driven by something else. I think that this concept is equally useful for thinking about autism. Now, of course, this is not to imply that there aren't legitimate paraphilias that occur in this population, but rather to make the point that behaviors that might have clear implications in a typical person may have other roots in autism. Here again is the film Adam, and just one more illustration from this film.
sir. What are you doing there? I said, what you doing?
Watching the children.
Uh-huh. Let me have some ID, sir.
I was looking at the children.
Sir, turn around. Put your hands on the fence, please.
Why are you doing this?
Lean.
So once again, Adam's mistake was not to understand the way in which his behavior would appear to others. So we all enjoy watching children, but we recognize that if we do it in certain ways, so looking through the fence at a school, it may draw the attention of people like law enforcement. And so this situation in this film escalated, but then was diffused. But I think there are often misinterpretations like this which are at the root of situations which escalate in a legal sense. So a breakdown in theory of mind leads to a breakdown in a person's ability to understand how their behavior may appear, and in turn can lead to counterfeit deviance. As I mentioned, it's not that all illegal behaviors in ASD are counterfeit. Other things are as they appear. But even when things are as they appear, I think there is more to the story when autism is in the picture. I wanted to switch topics for a few minutes to pathways to offending, a class of issues that have to do with the sad state of affairs in our world, and a lot to do with the internet. One of the most common reasons for people with autism to get in trouble is internet-based crimes, and in particular, viewing images of child abuse. I use the term images of child abuse or exploitation because the term child pornography has all sorts of implications which distract from the nature of the actual images and the repugnant nature of the images, and in my opinion, contribute to legitimizing them. I want to talk about gateway phenomena. Does anyone recognize these gates? If you're not from Edinburgh and you do, you may not have been spending all of your time at the conference. But anyway, so what are gates? Gates are the public face of something that is clearly intended to be kept private. The term gateway is part of a standard lingo in addictions and substances, but I also think the concept is equally applicable and useful when you here and with things you can encounter on the internet. In fact, as you'll see in a minute, I think that there are gateway factors which predate the internet also. Here are some things which I think are gateways. I'm going to talk about the first two only because of time constraints, but I'd also appreciate any thoughts on other gateway phenomena. My email will be at the end of this talk, and please do send me an email if you think of other things or have comments on this. So the two I'm going to be talking about are neoteny and the mainstream sexualization of minors. So neoteny, this is defined as the retention of juvenile features in an adult animal. And I wanted to talk first about the first thing I wanted to talk about is the use of sexualized neoteny. Neoteny is the retention, again, of juvenile features in an adult animal, and a great example is Betty Boop, cartoon from the early 1900s from the US. So in this cartoon, you see some human features which are labeled as neotenous or which could be thought of as neotenous, such as a large head, short arms and legs relative to total height, and clumsy childlike movements when you see the actual animated cartoon. More to the point, Betty Boop was described in a 1934 court case, and this was not a court case which had anything to do with sexualization of minors or anything like that. It was a copyright case. But anyway, the description, I think, is interesting. She was described as combining in appearance the childish with the sophisticated, a large round baby face with big eyes and a nose like a button, framed in a somewhat careful coiffure, with a very small body of which perhaps the leading characteristic is the most self-confident little bust imaginable. This was a copyright case again. In a more direct example of this phenomenon, I wanted to mention graphic cartoons, of which this is a PG-13 version, or a 15 in the UK. Much of the effect of these types of images depends on neoteny. This is a sexualized adult body with an exaggerated child's face. It makes complete sense to me that viewing material from this genre is a step towards viewing images of the sexual abuse of children. So it's an example of what I mean when I talk about gateway images. Another gateway phenomenon is the mainstream sexualization of children. So consider the plethora of images like this you encounter every day on MTV, advertising. Everywhere you look, there are sorts of images like this. And I want you to think about those images and take a look at these Copine criteria and think about where you think these images fit in. So I would argue that they fit right between erotica and erotic posing. between posing and explicit erotic posing, so at erotic posing, so number 5, which is clothed children in sexualized or provocative poses. So they're, I think, substantially far up on this scale. I think that it's important to consider the effect that stuff like this has on our children, but there are also effects on adults, and this is kind of what we're talking about today. The overarching issue with these gateway phenomena is the ability of a person to discern what the line is, and this goes back to the counterfeit, deviance, and theory of mind thing. If I don't get the way that this will appear to people, what stops me from looking further? This ability to discern is related to the ability to assess the appropriateness of behavior you are seeing modeled or endorsed on a screen. In summary, then, I think there are a couple of major reasons why people with autism can end up in trouble for sexual things. One category being counterfeit deviance, the other these gateway phenomena. As people with expertise in autism, we can help with the counterfeit deviance bit by helping to explain things to the legal system, as you'll hear about in Mr. Mahoney's talk. But it is also our responsibility as a society to clean up our act when it comes to these gateway factors. So again, thank you, and we're going to switch now to our next presentation.
Child pornography laws, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on here, presume that anyone who crosses the boundary between viewing online sexual images of individuals over a certain age and viewing such images of those under that age are sexually deviant and dangerous to children. A young man with autism will very likely view all sorts of sexual material online with no clue that they're crossing any of these boundaries. And they'll do it often compulsively to a degree which causes greater concern about their behavior. The number of images possessed in child pornography cases is a very big factor in determining what the sentencing would be and what the attitude of prosecutors is going to be. The perfect storm that arises from this situation is evident in the following statement by a U.S. District Court judge in a sentence that was imposed in May of 2011. That's the next slide. There was nothing extraordinary about this case. This was a case of mere possession of child pornography by a young man who presented archetypical signs of Asperger's syndrome. He had significant capabilities in dealing with computers and technical issues, and yet he was extremely isolated and immature socially, with absolutely no consciousness of any of the boundaries that are laid out in the social or legal taboos relating to online sexual images. The other thing that's interesting about this is this particular judge who spoke so broadly about Asperger's as a defense had only experience with one other case she had heard about. And so, thank you very much. So she was speaking very broadly, which shows the inherent hostility toward excuses for looking at child pornography in general, but specifically autism, which she was very confused by, I think. So when we look at this perfect storm that I describe, on the one side is the child pornography possession laws. The punishments are very harsh, and here I'm just talking about possession, basically not people who produce or create child pornography. Sentencing varies from one country to another, but there's a very common feature in all countries which do criminalize personal possession of child pornography, which is sex offender registration. As all of you know, and I think you do know, that jail time, although very difficult for somebody with autism, doesn't compare to the lifelong additional disability of being required to register as a sex offender, which superimposed upon the disabilities of having the condition at all makes life essentially very, very difficult. And of course, there's the stigma of somebody looking at who's looked at child pornography. Prosecutors assume that that person is looking at child pornography because they have an interest in sex with children. The problem is that's really not the case in the clients that I'm talking about. And they are trained to believe, and this happens in sex offender treatment programs, trained to believe that the person who looks at images online of a child being abused has the same mental status as the person who physically abuses the child. And so this is the mind state that prosecutors and law enforcement bring to these cases. There are a lot of different kinds of degrees of child pornography laws in place in the country. The dark green countries are the ones that have the highest level of laws. The light green country they also have the typical laws banning possession of child pornography and so on. The sentencings may change. The yellow countries have no laws. The yellow countries have some law. The red countries have no laws. And the light green countries, you just see mostly in Northern Africa and the Middle East, have general bans on pornography. So there's not uniform treatment of child pornography around the world. But as far as sentencing goes, in the U.S., these are the average sentencing going from 1992 up to 2010. And you see some dipping beginning in the 2008-2009 period. But basically, for those who receive child pornography or distribute child pornography, which can be very accidental, the average sentencing is over 10 years. For those who only possess child pornography or charged with possession of child pornography, the average sentencing is around 5 years. And the thing to understand here is that in the U.S., only 1% of individuals will get a non-jail sentence. So that means that 99% of the people charged get jail within these ranges, and that includes those with autism disorders. So, and we're trying to make some changes in that. I'll tell you about what I do and what needs to be done. But the point to make in this chart, looking at the difference between the two lines, receipt of child pornography is on the upper line as well. People don't have child pornography without receiving it over the internet. And so prosecutors can arbitrarily choose in the United States whether to charge, and I think other countries, whether to charge simple possession or receipt over the internet of child pornography, which allows them to include in the U.S. a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. Mandatory, it can't be deviated from by the judge. So this means in any case where a young man who has Asperger's has been viewing child pornography online, that person could be charged to a minimum of charged with receipt of child pornography and sentenced to 5 years in prison at a minimum. In contrast, here in England and Wales, when the records I found showed that almost around a third, only around a third are actually given prison for simple possession cases. What I don't know is what percentage of those include cases where issues of autism have arisen. I've had a very difficult time finding out the extent to which that is sort of on the radar screen in terms of determining the outcomes of these cases. The sentences are different. Canada has some mandatory minimum sentences, but they're much lower than U.S. In other countries, France, for production of child pornography, the maximum sentence is 5 years. For mere possession, the maximum sentence is 2 years. So it's a very big difference. But again, they all do involve reporting as sex offenders, which may be, I think in many cases, certainly is the bigger problem. On the side of the individual who has this autism condition, they have this problem of being, first of all, interested in sex. They on the internet looking to learn about romance and sex. They're comfortable with computers, but because of their social disability and not having learned about social conventions, no red flags go up for them when they look at erotic images where the age of the person who's depicted changes and gets lower and lower. They simply lack the blameworthiness that we normally associate with people who are viewing child pornography online. The blameworthiness we associate with criminality. But they're behaving like deviant persons, and hence the term we have of counterfeit deviance. The other problem is that it only takes very brief questioning by police to educate them about these taboos, educate them about the reasons why child pornography is prohibited. And then they parrot that back to the police in a statement taken by the police, and then they appear then to a judge or prosecutor as knowledgeable. And all their lack of social sense prior to that time gets wiped out because they quickly learn and absorb what this authority figure tells them about child pornography. And so it makes it very difficult for a prosecutor to later accept the notion of counterfeit deviance, the notion that they didn't really understand that this was wrong and that they had crossed those boundaries. The typical case, this is, and of course at the other end of it, if they go to prison, and to this point in time, the vast majority of them do, they suffer all the problems of a new complex social system that they have impossible for them to figure out. They become victimized. They will tattle. They'll tell on other inmates who violate the rules, which is not a good thing to do in prison, and they end up being held in solitary confinement in prison for most of the time. One young man I knew was in prison for 3 years, and he was in solitary confinement for 2.5 of those years. Finally, again, they are facing both sex offender registration on top of their disability, which I call civil death. Part of the problem in this is we have, as a result of the tendencies. Well, let me begin by saying when I've gotten cases like this, the first thing you notice is all of them involve parents who have struggled for a long time to give their child a normal life. They've done everything they can. And when they realize that the child is now in all this difficulty because of online viewing, they feel tremendously guilty about not having thought of this and not having trained their child and taught their child. And service providers, the clinicians, they feel terribly guilty about it because there really is nothing in place right now in most areas to educate children with autism about the dangers. And then they get to court, and they're basically given an ultimatum. If you don't plead guilty to this charge, then there could be a more serious charge of receipt involving a mandatory minimum sentence or whatever. And so the families generally end up quickly pleading guilty, have their child plead guilty. And it's the parents that decide this, by the way. As we all know, it's not going to be the child, even if the child is now 25 years old or 26 years old. Parents really don't know what to do. Part of the problem is that prosecutors Part of the problem is that prosecutors have no knowledge about autism. They have mistaken impressions about it. They feel that looking at child pornography is going to be considered as one of these fixated interests, special interests that can't be removed, and so they don't want to bring it up because they're afraid if they talk about Asperger's, the prosecutor or judge is going to say, well, this is one of their special interests and it's going to be there forever, so there's nothing we can do about it. They don't know enough to talk about the tendency to follow rules and how with proper therapy and behavioral therapy they can avoid this behavior. They will tend to go to a regular forensic psychologist or psychiatrist who knows nothing about autism, who very likely is going to come up with some other misdiagnosis, not understand the role autism plays and their lack of social adaptation plays in bringing on the behavior. So it becomes, the defense lawyer themselves become part of the problem because they don't properly understand how autism plays into it. With prosecutors as well, I've lost my prosecutor slide. So prosecutors, their primary concern is about child exploitation. That's their main thing. And as soon as they see somebody looking at child pornography, that's all they're concerned about. They see nothing but the danger. Also, the oddity, the fact that the person seems odd in some way, escalates their sense of danger. And so they are more likely to say this person is weird, and so that to me speaks of more danger. They're afraid of opening the floodgates, that everybody, as this judge said in one of the earlier slides, that everybody has Asperger's. Once they're charged with child pornography, everybody's going to say they have Asperger's, and the prosecutor's not going to be able to figure out how to differentiate between those who really have these severe social deficits that lead to a lack of blameworthiness in what they've looked at, and others who are simply looking for some excuse to avoid prosecution. Prosecutors don't see sex offender registration as being that big a deal. They say, well, we're just keeping track of people, and it really shouldn't make much of a difference. We know really otherwise. So looking at the principles that that I espouse and am trying to advocate. One is that presumptively, individuals who have these severe social learning deficits should not be prosecuted. If they don't know it's wrong, if these red flags don't come up, they shouldn't be prosecuted. It's not a defense at trial. These child pornography laws do not allow as an excuse that somebody does not know that it was wrong. So there really is a need to educate prosecutors and judges about this concept of counterfeit deviance as a way to conceptualize somebody who's engaging in apparently deviant behavior without actually having the mindset of somebody who we think is being criminal. And this involves, for the lawyer, lawyers do not like to have parents involved. They're not used to having parents involved in framing what the defense should be and how they should conduct the defense. They find parents of children with autism being meddlesome and overly protective and naive. And so because they don't really understand how the real world works, when the parents are trying to speak to the lawyer about the degree of deficits of their child, which they may not fully understand because they may have very inadequate diagnoses. They may never have had any kind of social adaptation skills testing like Vineland or ABAS testing to see what level that child's operating with respect to that his ability to learn what the social rules are and then apply them. So there's a total lack of information that defense attorneys have, and that's what is needed to be done. They need to find out from the parents, what's the story of your child? What is your child's developmental history? Tell me step by step what the struggles were for you as a parent in raising this child and getting them to learn how to deal in society. And then the lawyer can go and take that to the prosecutor and take that to the judge and say, this is different. This is not the kind of case you normally see, and this requires some different outcomes. But that takes a lot of work, and lawyers typically don't have enough time in the time schedule allowed to resolve these cases to learn all they need to learn. What they really need help from professionals, from researchers and clinicians who know about autism to teach them so they can teach prosecutors. So what my job, what I try to do is try to teach prosecutors about counterfeit deviance, tell them the entire history of the child, the struggles of the parent in raising the child, and get them to agree to not prosecute at all, to make this not a criminal case, divert it from the criminal process. Alternatively, what we need to do is get prosecutors to agree to let a person, if they have to plead guilty to some crime, make it a crime that does not involve sex offender registration. That's happened so far in the United States in only 4 cases. 3 of them were my cases. There's only been 1 case in the United States so far where there's been expressed diversion from criminal process for somebody on account of their autism, and that was a case of mine. So this is not a widespread, when I say this, that this is what should be done, this is not the reality yet. We're talking about a tiny, tiny amount of cases, and really the hope we have for the future of how these cases should be done. How am I doing on time here?
You're finished time-wise.
Okay, I guess I'm finished time-wise. The only thing I can say is I do have a paper on this that you can find just by Googling my name and Asperger's on the internet, and you'll find this right away. And it's a very long paper that tells you sort of where I'm coming from on all this.
It's probably obvious to you by now that it is not our intent to vilify people with autism. Indeed, people with autism are much more likely to be the victims of crimes, including sexual offenses, than they are the perpetrators. Adolescence has been described as the second crisis. Individuals with ASD may have sexual feelings that are out of sync with their social and emotional levels of awareness. And as they grow older, this disparity gets greater and greater. Unfortunately, society tends to judge the person and base their expectations on the chronological age of the person with autism rather than their developmental age. So when we think about process models that explain general pathways to pedophilia, Process models serve to explain the course of offending and the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences that are related to the offending behavior. So the most common model is the Finkelhor model, and that identifies pathways to child sexual abuse as progressing through 4 stages. Oops. So stage 1 considers the genesis of the event. The perpetrator may be a pedophile who has a specific sexual attraction to children and an emotional congruence. They may find sexual activity with children to be sexually arousing. They may identify more closely with children and may have a lack of sexual alternative sources for gratification. So in terms of the population of people with autism, regarding a pedophilic orientation, it's unclear and unknown the rates of pedophilia among people with autism. However, there are parts of stage 1 that may better explain why people with autism have sexual contact with children. This idea of emotional congruence, or more closely identifying with a child, may be the result that people with autism often have interests that are more typical of children and people that are younger, and as a result experience emotional congruence with children. For example, if any of you have read Dr. Nick Dubbin's wonderful book, Autism, Asperger's, Sexuality, and the Law, Dr. Nick Dubbin is a PhD who was arrested on possessing images of child exploitation. And when questioned, he said, I imagine myself to be the same age of the children in the images I was viewing, and I wanted to be friends with them. This issue of lack of appropriate sexual outlets may also apply to people with ASD. Many people with ASD do desire romantic and intimate relationships, but may struggle with the social skills required to have one of those relationships. There also may be external prohibitions against having relationships. For example, in many group homes in the United States, people with disabilities are prohibited from having a sexual relationship with anyone in the home. In stage 2, the offender develops mechanisms to override inhibitions that result from fear of being apprehended or the acknowledgement that they're violating social taboos. So the offender may use drugs or alcohol to override those inhibitions and those reservations. Or they may develop something called cognitive distortions, which allows them to interpret the behavior of the victim in a way that justifies or legitimizes their own behavior. So Dr. Loftin and I have worked with a number of different sexual offenders, both with and without autism, and they may say, well, adolescents are looking for it by the way they dress or the way they act. For autistic offenders, there may be little to no awareness of these societal taboos. For example, unless explicitly told, some people with ASD may not be aware that there's an age of consent. So as Dr. Westphal mentioned earlier, there may be times that the person with autism knows, I have to know the person, they have to like me, I have to like them, I have to ask their permission, but the piece they forget or have never been taught is, and they have to be over the age of consent. Stage 3 is overcoming external obstacles. So in stage 3, it's about surmounting the external obstacles with the goal of increasing activity and contact with the victim. Now, savvy predators may purposely place themselves in a position of trust and work diligently to gain the trust of a child. In the State v. Burr, which was a case in the United States, there was a piano teacher who was accused of fondling one of his students. And the defense claimed that contact with the child was misunderstood. The gentleman was sitting the child on his lap because she couldn't reach the keys. And the defense argued that the man with ASD lacked the social dexterity to groom the victim as a predator without autism would do. And that stage 3 is surmounting those external obstacles and accessing or gaining access to the child. Now, for the perpetrator with autism, the person may not purposely place themselves in a position of trust to gain sexual contact with the child. Rather, that contact may arise because of those shared interests that are immature relative to their chronological age. For example, we've worked with a number of people that have a strong interest in My Little Pony, which is typically not something interesting to an adult male, but is often interesting to adult men with autism. In stage 4, predators without autism attempt to overcome child noncompliance by breaking down the barriers that exist between themselves and the child with the goal of escalating the type and amount of sexual contact with children. And to do that, they use attractors like video games or money or the lure of fame, or interactors, drugs, alcohol, pornography, to lower the inhibitions of the child. They may also use intimidation and force against the child. Now, the person with ASD typically does not do this, in part because this would require the person with ASD to recognize that they had power over the child. And because of those difficulties with perspective taking, it would be difficult for them to determine how the child is perceiving them. So for these reasons, we feel that traditional process models, like the Finkelhor model, are inadequate to explain why people with ASD commit sexual offenses against children. So this is what we believe to be a better explanation of the potential pathways to offending for people with ASD. So there's this issue of naivete that Mr. Mahoney referred to. At times, people with ASD may be duped or dared into committing a sexual offense. We've worked with clients who have been dared to kiss that girl, touch that girl, pull down your pants and show that girl, etc. Then there's this idea of lack of sexual awareness. I've worked with clients who have been accused of sexual offending for masturbating in public, for urinating in public, or recently a case where a young man with significant developmental disabilities was on his way to the toilet and pulled down his pants on the way to the toilet. And when a mother in a cafe with her young daughter saw this, she reported it to the police, and he was accused of a sexual offense of exposing himself. Then there's this idea of lack of understanding of the inappropriateness of sexual relationships with minors. I have worked with people who have not realized that there is an age of consent and found out the hard way, that indeed there is an age of consent, and if a person over the age of consent has relationships with a person under the age of consent, that's a sexual offense. Then preoccupations with sexual connotations. As Dr. Westphal spoke about earlier, this idea of perfume. We've also worked with people that have had interest in silky garments and underwear and other things that have sexual connotations, and yet for the person with autism, it's more of a sensory issue of feeling silky things rather than something sexual. So it could have been anything silky, not necessarily an undergarment. And then there's this idea of the lack of sexual awareness around the social skills being so disparate as the person with ASD grows older. And as I mentioned in Nick Dubbin's book, he did say that he identified more closely with the children in the images that he was viewing than he identified with himself as an adult. So when I think about the differences in offending for the person with autism versus the person without autism, I'm reminded of a quote I once heard when a person without autism was convicted of a sexual offense. And he said to me, "Show me a kid who doesn't know about sex, and I'll show you my next victim." I can't begin to tell you the number of times that Dr. Loftin and I have sat across from people with autism in jail or in prison who have said to us, "I learned the rules by breaking them." I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Loftin, who's going to talk to us about how we can teach people with autism the rules to prevent them from engaging in behaviors that reach the level of criminality. Thank you.
Hi. One thing I'd like to start off by saying that we haven't fully acknowledged, but I want you to be aware that all of my panelists, and I know this, for the vast, vast, vast majority of autistic people, sexual issues are not going to be a thing at all. However, there is a small subset who, for all these other reasons we've discussed, failure of education, other reasons, do come into trouble with the law or trouble just in the community. And we want to make sure that we have the right interventions and supports in place for that subgroup. So I know everyone in this room knows autism and we know this, but I think it bears repeating. Victimization, as Dr. Sperry mentioned, is the primary risk. So even though I'm speaking about offending, and we've all been speaking about offending, individuals with autism are much more likely to be on the receiving end of unwanted sexual behavior than to be perpetrating it. And we do all believe that it's a failure to educate, a failure to have appropriate supports in the community, a failure to have the social structures in place that we need to promote healthy sexuality that most often lead to these problem behaviors, that these problem sexual behaviors are indeed inadvertent rather than deliberate. Dr. Westphal talked a little bit about theory of mind, and I just want to be a little more specific about how theory of mind can interfere with the development of healthy sexuality. An individual might not understand what another person wants. That's hard for any of us in a relationship. But if you are an autistic person, it can be particularly challenging to understand what your partner wants. You might not understand how others are perceiving you and what they're thinking, which can lead to the counterfeit deviance difficulty that was raised earlier. Difficulty perceiving the emotional responses of others is also a concern. So we need to constantly in relationships be aware of other people's emotional responses to us and adjust our behavior accordingly. It's a very sophisticated and challenging dance if you have a social learning disability. And then difficulties with perspective taking. So not only do you have to recognize and understand the emotional response, but you have to put yourself in that person's shoes and kind of predict what they're going to do. So the whole idea of theory of mind is really complex. And if you have any deficits in this area, whether they be related to autism or not, you're going to have challenges in close interpersonal relationships. I want to illustrate the theory of mind deficits in autism and how they've related with some of the cases I've had. As Dr. Sperry mentioned, we do evaluate a lot of individuals who are arrested for looking at images of child exploitation. These are some example responses I've had when I've asked these guys, why is child pornography wrong? Why don't people want you looking at this stuff? And as you can see, these are very naive responses that reflect a true lack of understanding about why we have these laws. I think the middle one is the clearest. This is a guy with an ongoing case, so we're not sure how his case is going to come out. But when asked very directly, why is this wrong, he's really concerned that maybe this young girl is going to get pregnant and her body's just not ready for it. Sure, that's a concern, but not the primary concern in cases of child pornography. Some of the features that we associate with autism can have an impact on whether or not individuals can develop sexual relationships. So social communication, for example, is very important. Reciprocity in communication, reading nonverbal cues, innuendo and flirting. Again, things that are challenging for everybody. If you have social difficulties, they become even more challenging, even harder to establish relationships. The more atypical behaviors of autism can also impact relationships. Insistence on sameness, so really preferring your set routines or doing things in a particular way can promote a challenge. I think we've all had this difficulty when we get into a relationship because we all as humans have a certain way we like to do things. If it goes so far as to be a symptom for you, where you really insist and have to have things a certain way, it places even a greater demand on the relationship. It's even more difficult to manage. Sensory experiences, so being very sensitive to sensory input. A lot of people think tactile input when we're talking about sex and intimate relationships, but I think auditory input is a big one too. I've had a number of people who are very sensitive to mouth sounds that make even dating hard. I know someone who can't sit next to anyone in a movie theater who's eating popcorn because the mouth noises are just so overwhelming, and that affects the whole dating process. And behavioral rigidity, we've kind of alluded to. Anxiety, and unfortunately I wasn't able to hear the anxiety session this morning because I was waiting to present and hear, but anxiety is predominant for many people with autism, and it comes up a lot in novel situations. Dating and sexuality require constant exposure to novelty. You never quite know what the other person's going to do, and there has to be a very sophisticated dance that happens. So that can raise a lot of anxiety for individuals. But then also social anxiety. It can be a real barrier for people with autism to put themselves out there. I have a close family member with autism who doesn't date, and he's in his mid-30s, and it really is simply the social anxiety that holds him back. He has everything else he needs. He'd be a great candidate, but he's just so afraid of those social interactions and feels so unprepared to manage them. So with this context, thinking about coming from this perspective, individuals with autism are often provided very poor or very limited information about sexuality. When they are provided information about sexuality, it's generally not tailored to their learning needs and styles. But where are they getting information? Unfortunately, often young people are getting information about sexuality from pornography. This isn't an anti-pornography speech. I don't think it's necessarily a problem that it exists. But if it's your sole source of information about healthy sexuality, it's a problem. It doesn't reflect reality, so that can be a real difficulty. Media is a problem. And unfortunately, portrayals of social interaction and intimate relationships in the media also aren't realistic, and they can set people up to have these expectations that are unmeetable. My colleague, Dr. Sperry, does a lot of work with stalking. And unfortunately, a lot of men with autism are arrested for stalking. If you want to learn how to stalk, watch a few romantic comedies. They really are like how-to primers. If you're talking about an autistic individual, maybe someone for whom video modeling is a great intervention, they watch a few of these stalking videos and it really trains them up on how to do this. And that's not a great way to learn about building intimate relationships. And then finally, the social media is a great source of information, a great way to stay connected. I think it's a good tool for people. But unfortunately, if you have difficulty filtering through information and understanding when people are being honest and open and when people are presenting only their best self and putting themselves out there, it's giving you some unrealistic information about what actually happens in intimate relationships and what actually happens with sex. And unfortunately, the missing source here, we've got all this media, but we don't have young people talking to each other and learning about sex from each other. I'm sure if we were to take a survey in this room, most of us learned about slang terms and different sex positions, or I don't know, all the things you learn as a young person from our friends. I mean, that's where we acquire that information. That's where we talk it through. And it's also where we get very valuable feedback on what's okay to do and say and what's not okay to do and say. And if you're not talking to your peers and you don't have a broader peer group to have those conversations, you're missing out on that valuable source of learning. There we go. Interest of time, I'm going to skip that. Mark referred to the idea of a perfect storm, which is funny because I have this perfect storm slide. But I think when we have a number of these factors coming together, the likelihood of problem sexual behavior is much higher. And so I'll talk these through quickly. Lexi at the beginning, Dr. Westphal talked about the sexualization of children in the media. We have a number of slides we didn't show in the interest of time that show children in various states of undress. We have a show in the US called Toddlers and Tiaras. Do you know what that is here? It's basically a beauty pageant for young children in which these children come out dressed like Vegas showgirls. And there are a number of sources like that. I have a lot of ads I can show images of, but these images are pervasive. And if you're an autistic person encountering these images out in the world without any other context or any information to counter that, how would you know that this is wrong? How would you know that we can't sexualize this young person because they're being sexualized all over the place? Isolation. We have very poor programming for adolescents and young adults. And so these individuals are often alone in a room somewhere, usually on the computer. And as I mentioned earlier in talking about peers, if you're missing other sources of information, you're only zoning in on what you're interested in and what you're pursuing, it can lead you down some very bad paths. No competing information is getting in there to help you think more openly. We see this not just with sexual problems, but with racism or other fixed ideas where people can become very obsessed and just kind of lead down problem paths. Stickiness. In autism, this can be a great strength. You know, the ability to kind of zero in and get focused, but it can also work to someone's detriment if they're really stuck on an idea. If that idea is collecting images online, and sometimes you're getting groups of images from someone you don't know very well, that could include images of child pornography, and it often does, unfortunately. So that stickiness or obsessiveness that can be an asset can also be a huge problem here. Limited and very, very poor sexuality education, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Excessive time spent online. There are some studies emerging now that show that individuals with autism spend more time than typically developing people online. Again, that's something that can be a great strength, that can be a wonderful tool, right? Having access to all this information, having access to this technology, but it can also work to a person's detriment if that time is not structured and organized in a way that's healthy for them. And then the last bit, which Dr. Sperry mentioned, the chronological age of individuals with autism is often far in excess of the developmental age, so that you may see someone who looks like an adult, but really in terms of their social interests and in terms of who their peer group is or who they'd like their peer group to be, we're talking much, much, much younger, and that can be difficult. This is just a different image to break down those ideas, but I like to think about risk at a number of different levels, kind of going from the society level, and we need to add some things there about programming, of course, but from the society level to the family level, where there's often poor supervision or there's minimizing sexual behaviors or insisting that an individual isn't sexual when we do know that most people are, whether or not mom wants to admit it. And then also the individual level with certain traits that may make some problem behaviors more likely to occur. Overall, I think what we need to be doing is interfering long before an offense takes place. We need to be providing excellent education and being comprehensive about that, and then giving young people a way to better interpret the information that's in the media so that they're not just taking these things in and accepting them as they appear to be, but better understanding why sex is used in media, why sex is used to sell things in advertising, and exactly where the limits and parameters are. In the interest of time, I do want to leave a lot of time for questions. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to give an example of from a study that I did where we ran a number of sex education groups for young people on how we broke down a complex issue, and I'll give the example of viewing pornography online, and how we explicitly taught all the steps and the parameters for what's acceptable and what's not. I do want to say, just in teaching in general for sexuality education for autistic people, it's very important to provide the facts and the information, but also throughout the process to consider the social aspects. So thinking about the what to do, what not to do, but more importantly, why. why we have these rules, why we have these constraints in society, so that you're not just telling a person what to do and what not to do, but why this matters and how it helps you operate in society. So I'm skipping to the porn piece. So there's some broad ideas I think it's very important to teach about porn for people with autism. Number one, given the context of this talk and just the work I do in general, I always start off by talking about exactly what's legal and exactly what's illegal. I make it very clear, very blatant, no question, this is legal, you will get in trouble if you do this. They will find out if you do this. I talk really specifically too about anything you do online runs a pretty substantial risk of being seen by someone else. So just to always have that in mind, nothing is really secret, nothing is really private. I like to explain that porn is kind of, this is a quote from a New York Times article, but it's one shadowy and loveless corner of the internet, meaning that these things, these hookups or whatever you see in pornography do not really reflect everything that happens in relationships. You're seeing this sliver, which is a legitimate sliver, but it isn't kind of the richness and the complexity of actual relationships. Bodies respond differently from minds, meaning that you may be aroused by things that you're seeing, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is a sexual interest for you, this is something you have to pursue, this is an orientation for you. These things are really complex, and just responding to something doesn't mean anything. And I'll even give them an example. There are a number of studies on women and the sexual responsiveness of women, and they found that women in a lab can get aroused by looking at monkey sex. Does that mean that the average woman wants to go have sex with a monkey? No. And I'm just that frank with them to help understand, you're gonna see a lot of stuff, and some of it you might have a reaction to and not, but let's stick with what's legal. Let's think about, all of these parameters. And then I explain what exploitation is and how it does happen in legal pornography and in illegal pornography. And here's exactly what might happen. Here's, if you're worried about that, here's what you could think about, or some search term you could use to make sure that you're looking at things that maybe you feel more comfortable with. We talk a lot about the social perception of pornography. What are other people going to think if they hear you talk about this or know you're doing this? So what are those circles in which this is something you could bring up or something you would not want to raise? How you should talk about it, what terms you should use. It's interesting, I had one guy who told me, I never look at pornography, but have you ever seen the ladies of WrestleMania and the bikinis that they wear? And then he went on, and obviously this was his pornography, so we had to talk about how you can talk about being interested in the ladies of WrestleMania, but we have to do that carefully because it starts to get a little uncomfortable for other people. We talk very specifically about how pornography is kabuki theater, meaning it's over-traumatic, and the way people are behaving in these scenarios is not really what's going to happen. It's fake. So if you do what happens in pornography without warm-up, without consent, you can end up hurting somebody or getting arrested. So here are some ways that pornography is fake, and I'll be pretty direct about that. The example I often use when I'm presenting is nobody jumps into anal sex on a first date. That would be a rare thing in any context. Gay, straight, any context, that's rare. And I don't think individuals viewing porn without any other context understand even that kind of a simple fact. Body image issues come up a lot for people who are frequently viewing porn, so I think it's important to talk through healthy body image. And then just the different range of acts. I will go to the Kinsey Institute website, which is an American sex research organization, and look up with some of my patients, well, how many people say they actually do this thing? How many people actually say they do that thing? Because I think a lot of us get very distorted ideas about what's happening in everybody else's sex lives, and sometimes it's helpful to provide concrete information about what's really going on. And then this is the last bit I'll tell you about this, and we'll switch to questions, but I think it's really important to be concrete about where in the home it's okay to look at pornography, which electronics it's okay to do this on, how to clear browser history, how to set privacy parameters on things, what search terms it's okay to use and not use. And I will say very explicitly, you can't use the word girls or boys. You have to say women, you have to say men. You can put the word adult in there, you could put the word mature in there, although that might get you something you don't quite want. And we kind of go through very specifically what's okay to use and what's not okay. Warning about pop-ups and exactly what those are. Especially, there seem to be some pop-ups that come up where it looks like a live person wants to interact with you and talk with you, and that can be very tempting for a lonely young person. And so we talk very clearly about maybe you don't want to do that. Here's what that actually is. Here's how that could affect you. And then not to be crass, but some cleanup, just to make sure that the individual's being respectful of other people living in their environment. This is my contact info. I know I rushed through because I want to get to questions, but if you do have questions specifically for me, I'm happy to take those by email. Laurie, Sperry, Dr. Alexander Westphal, who was first, and I are also part of a group called Autism Forensics, which is housed at Yale. And so that's our Twitter handle too, if you want to reach out to us that way. And so I think we'll go now to questions.
Yeah, thanks. I guess what kind of interests me is, from parents' perspective, these kinds of topics can be extraordinarily difficult to deal with a fully, normally functional teenager. How do you deal with them when you've got a child who has an autistic disorder, and I don't like the disorder, an autistic condition, and then what kind of programs are available to teach parents how to deal with this? Because without that, parents are going to make all the mistakes that you don't want them to make. So I was wondering what kind of programs are available, and if not, what would you recommend for a program for parents in order to train them to teach their young people?
Yeah. I don't know if you have ideas. I can go first on that, and then maybe others want to chime in. We don't have anything fantastic, unfortunately. We have, I try to talk in the community and give seminars and help on this, but I think fundamentally it's uncomfortable for parents to talk with kids about sex. And so I think systematically getting better sexuality education in the school has been the angle I've tried to focus on, although I haven't gotten very far in America with that yet. But I think having parent groups that coincide would be fantastic. I don't have any great tips. I do often tell parents, though, that it's helpful to keep information out. So even if you're uncomfortable talking, if you have some great books and maybe you bookmark some really excellent sex education websites, that can go a long way to counteracting all of the bad information that's out there. But if you have ideas, I'd be happy to talk with you about things we could do for parents.
I think we need to work on that.
Mark, one of the things that I've found helpful for parents is to help them remember that their child is a teenager, an adolescent first. So, this would be happening with or without the autism, that they would start to have these emerging sexual feelings. So kind of focusing on that piece, that this is a teenager and this is what teenagers go through. And then think about what are teaching strategies that we've used in the past that work for other things. So can we, task analyze, use visual supports to help make it as concrete and literal as possible for the person with ASD. Because, as you and I know from our most recent paper, in studies, people with ASD score equal to their typically developing peers on matters of body part identification and menstruation. But what they don't understand is the social nuance of how to get access to those body parts. And so then there's that social component of making sure that we're addressing that. In terms of curriculums, Autism Speaks has a curriculum that looks at different stages of a child's life and what you might want to address. So there's a sexuality curriculum on the Autism Speaks website, and then Dr. Hinault has a sexuality curriculum that I've used parts of as well that I've found helpful.
I was impressed with the talk on sexual stories, or social stories, sorry. Enough of the sexual stories.
She's going to sell a lot more books.
In a way, it's much more simple to talk to a child with autism about this because they're so concrete. on these things, and we're way ahead of them, and we're thinking about all sorts of issues when really sometimes they just need to know the rules. And so there may be some very simple ways, and I must say, it's got to be earlier than you would normally think of intervening with a child who's going through adolescence, because long before the parent starts talking to the child about sexuality, they or their friends or whatever, they're looking online at stuff. And so, and just parents, they might think about pornography, but they're thinking about social relationships first, and not, it's the real problem is the parents haven't even thought about it. And they've gone through organizations that provide help for their children, and they're not thinking about it. They're thinking about it now. They're starting to really worry about it because they see this problem as being a huge problem. So I just thought from the discussion of social stories that in a way we're making it too complex. We can break it down just the bullet points that Rachel had would be enough really to be a very good palliative.
Thank you. There is a gentleman who's got the microphone in the middle.
Hi there, thank you. I have a concern based on some observations of the people that I support that online communities such as My Little Pony, which was referenced, these kind of gateways, are typically very, very accepting communities. They don't discriminate against people who want to kind of join in that social experience. And for a lot of young people with Asperger's, it seems to be that's their first big social opportunity. And then there seems to be this desire to please that community, which leads them to picking up more and more of the behaviours of that community and becoming a little bit more extreme and more involved in it when asked to explain why they like My Little Pony. For example, it's not necessarily anything about the cartoon or the characters, but it's about the response they get from people in that community. Is this something that you've noticed in your work?
Yeah, I think you've hit on something important, that a lot of times it's the My Little Pony community or the furry community that are fantastic, positive social supports in the community. So there's nothing inherently bad about having these interests and finding other people who share these interests. Quite the opposite. I think they often are a very positive force. There's a different version of my presentation I give where I talk a lot about furries, and I've had a number of patients who have really found a home there, found peers, found a support system, and I think it can be really good. The problem is when it turns the corner and then they start to look at pornography associated with these things, which in the case of My Little Pony, for example, is a child's interest as well, and then that can kind of be a slippery slope into the child pornography piece. But inherent, there's nothing wrong per se about these groups, and quite the opposite often.
But prosecutors have a very difficult time when they see the furries, they see My Little Pony. It's again contributes to the weirdness thing, which to them connotes danger.
Does everyone here know the term furry? It's not always sexual, but very, very often a sexual interest in mascot costumes or kind of look like basically real life stuffed animals. And so individuals in this community will often wear pieces of animal costume like a tail. There's a lot of art that's exchanged online, and it's very sexualized drawings and things of these different creatures. But there's some debate online about what percentage of furries actually have autism, and some people will say it's most.
Would you like?
I have a question primarily for Dr. Loftin. You talked very helpfully about educating about pornography. Can I ask specifically, though, whether you have any recommendations about teaching autistic teenagers with intellectual disabilities about the subject of pornography and how to communicate that information to those who struggle with the language skills and the understanding to engage with it at the level you were describing?
I'm afraid there's a little bit of your question I didn't hear, so I'm going to repeat it and you let me know if I got it right, please. Is the question how to teach those skills to people who have language impairment?
How to teach specifically about pornography to those with an intellectual disability or limited language?
Yeah, and I think this is where Mark's point about visual supports, and Laurie mentioned this too. I've made really clear charts about legal, illegal, or okay, not okay, if the term legal isn't understood. and very clear, search, we'll take an image from the search term and what they can use and what they can't. I think if there's a carer for the individual with the intellectual disability who could even show them how to do a couple bookmarks of things that are safe. I think once you're talking a certain level of intellectual disability, there needs to be a little more support from an external person probably, just to make sure that the individual stays safe. Maybe that's clearing the history, or maybe it's making sure no one else is present. The other thing that I found enormously helpful when it comes to things like masturbation or even sexual activity with another person is to show where it can be on a schedule. Because unfortunately, masturbation for some people is highly motivating and can override desire to do a lot of other things. And that's a normal thing that happens in adolescence. But most adolescents have the social wherewithal to relegate it to certain times and places. So sometimes even putting that into a calendar or putting private computer time into a visual schedule can be useful.
Those are all good strategies, but I think my question was about pornography specifically. You were talking about explaining why, about how pornography is exploitative, and I wondered whether you had any suggestions about how to get that kind of concept.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
At that conceptual level, how to communicate that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I don't know with my patients with intellectual disability whether that aspect is something I've covered. I think it's important, but it's a difficult concept for a lot of people to grasp. It's very complicated, so I don't have a great answer, but great question.
Yeah, it is indeed. Martijn.
Thank you. What struck me about all four speeches I've heard is that the central theme was theory of mind. Basically, all of these problems are blamed on the autistic person's broken empathy. And I would like to say that the theory of mind theory is actually controversial. It's losing ground. And I'd like to cite Dr. Damien Milton, who wrote about the double empathy problem and published about that. And essentially this means that empathy breaks down in about equally in both directions. Yep. In that light, I found interesting that after blaming everything on the autistic person's broken empathy, all speakers went on to describe disasters happening to the autistic person that were mainly the result of neurotypical society's abject failure to empathize with autistic people. Yep. And to make a question of this comment, I was wondering, first, has this even been considered? And second, what would you do about this? For instance, would you consider involving other autistic people in teaching the proper societal norms to autistic people? Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that. That's fantastic. We're continuing to evolve ourselves, so input like that is extremely needed and useful. I do work with individuals with autism, adults with autism, to have that input from them, but I think that peer-to-peer teaching you're asking about is fantastic, and it would be a great next iteration. I also think some of the societal level changes we're proposing would hopefully do exactly what it is you're seeking and get that empathy piece that's sorely missing from the other side. So having the community programs in place, having appropriate education in place, having some of these supports so that we're really not just setting up failure or perceived failure.
And additionally, Dr. Mezabov of Chapel Hill and I did a research study several years ago looking at the perceived social challenges from the perspective of the person with autism. And we ran social groups where the autistic people in the groups would say, this is what I think is a problem, not what you think is a problem. And then what was unique about that is that we had them resolve the social challenges for each other, rather than us saying, from a neurotypical perspective, this is what you need to do. And so we found that they were very able to solve each other's social challenges and say, this is a strategy that has worked for me from the perspective of a person with ASD. And we found that, that's research that's resonated throughout the autistic community, again, because I think it's not our imposition of societal norms, but rather their perception and understanding of societal norms. That's Sperry and Mezebov, 2005, Perceptions of Social Challenges of People with ASD.